In the 1980 presidential election, Ronald Reagan ran on a supply-side platform that promised to simultaneously cut taxes, increase government tax revenues, and accelerate the rate of economic growth without inducing inflation. A very sweet macroeconomic cure indeed. On the surface, the supply-side approach looks very similar to the kind of Keynesian tax cut prescribed in the 1960s to stimulate a sluggish economy. However, the supply-siders viewed such tax cuts from a very different behavioral perspective. Unlike the Keynesians, they did not agree that such a tax cut would necessarily cause inflation. Instead, the supply-siders believed that the American people would actually work much harder and invest much more if they were allowed to keep more of the fruits of their labor. The end result would be to increase the amount of goods and services our economy could actually produce by pushing out the economy's supply curve, hence supply-side economics. Most important, the supply-siders promised that by cutting taxes and thereby spurring rapid growth, the loss in tax revenues from the tax cut would be more than offset by the increase in tax revenues from increased economic growth. Thus, under supply-side economics, the budget deficit would actually be reduced. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. While the economy boomed, so too did America's budget deficit. And as the budget deficit soared, America's trade deficit soared with it. These so-called twin deficits deeply concerned Reagan's successor George Bush, particularly after the budget deficit jumped to over $200 billion at the midpoint of his term in 1990, and the economy began to slide into recession. To any red-blooded Keynesian, this onset of recession would have been a clear signal to engage in expansionary policy. However, in the Bush White House, Ronald Reagan's supply-side advisors had been supplanted not by Keynesians, but rather by a new breed of macroeconomic thinkers, the so-called New Classicals. New Classical economics is based on the controversial theory of rational expectations. This theory says that if you form your expectations rationally, you will take into account all available information, including the future effects of activist fiscal and monetary policies. The idea behind rational expectations is that such activist policies might be able to fool people for a while. However, after a while, people will learn from their experiences, and then you can't fool them at all. The central policy implication of this idea is, of course, profound. Rational expectations render activist fiscal and monetary policies completely ineffective, so they should be abandoned. We'll talk more about whether this theory is good economics or not in a later lesson, but it was clearly bad politics, at least for President Bush. Indeed, Bush's New Classical advisors flatly rejected any Keynesian quick fix to the deepening recession. Instead, they called for more stable and systematic policies based on long-term goals, rather than a continued reliance on short-sighted discretionary reactions. Bush took this New Classical advice, the economy limped into the 1992 presidential election, and, like Richard Nixon in 1960, Bush lost to a Democrat promising to get the economy moving again. What is perhaps most interesting about this transition of power is that Bill Clinton actually did very little to stimulate the economy. The mere fact, however, that Clinton promised a more activist approach helped restore business and consumer confidence. At the same time, congressional passage of Clinton's deficit reduction legislation in 1993 sent Wall Street a clear signal that his administration was serious about budget balance. Together, these factors helped accelerate a recovery that had already begun by the end of Bush's term. These factors also set the stage for Clinton's remarkably easy re-election in 1996, as well as the longest economic recovery in peacetime history.
The next decade would not, however, be anywhere near as kind or prosperous as the 1990s. Shortly after George Walker Bush took office in 2001, the U.S. economy would fall into recession, while by year's end, America would be hit by a 9/11 terrorist attack that would catapult the country into two expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In that same year of 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization and began flooding America with illegally subsidized exports. Over the next 10 years, the U.S. would shut down over 50,000 factories, lose more than 5 million manufacturing jobs, and see its historical annual rate of GDP growth cut by a full 2/3. On top of two wars and a burgeoning trade deficit, the U.S. economy would also be hit in 2007 with a massive collapse of a housing bubble and soon find itself in the worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. To pull a nation out of recession and slow growth, the White House and Congress would orchestrate the biggest fiscal stimulus in history, while the Federal Reserve would use new monetary policy tools like quantitative easing to likewise break the record for a huge monetary stimulus. All these fiscal and monetary stimuli would be to little avail, however, and in the 2010s, macroeconomists would once again find themselves in a rapidly changing global economy where traditional fiscal and monetary policy solutions were no longer working very well, and where countries around the globe faced deeper-seated structural issues seemingly resistant to Keynesian solutions. Of course, the major purpose of this introductory course in macroeconomics is to help all of us better understand the incredibly complex global economic forces now affecting both our personal and professional lives.
In the meantime, please remember that economics is not something to be memorized, but rather something to conceptualize. So as you study it, think about it too. Your job and your business might just depend on it.
I'm Peter Navarro from the University of California, Irvine.